Okay, so welcome to the History and PP at Oxford admissions assessment presentation. So the main sort of things we're trying to do today is just prepare anyone who's kind of interested in studying those subjects for actually the admissions assessments and allowing you to kind of give you the tools to go off and then independently prepare for that. Just a quick thing to mention, because a lot of people who look at Oxford and Cambridge, it's quite hard to choose between them. I will be releasing another thing about that very shortly, to maybe help with those sort of decisions. But one thing I would just say is this is only about Oxford, these presentations today, because Cambridge run a system where each college is allowed to choose what admissions assessment they use. It's usually done at interview, and it can vary from college to college, year to year. So there's no sort of direct advice I can give for that. But some of the skills I kind of talk about here may be quite useful for that. So the first thing I want to go through is the PPE assessment, which is the thinking skills assessment, as it's called. So it's not just for PPE, but there's some other courses listed on there. So we've got economics and management, experimental psychology, human sciences, and PPL as well. So if anyone's interested in those, then you'll have to do that. It's got two sections to this admissions assessment. The first section is the thinking skills assessment part. So you've got 50 multiple choice questions, so A, B, C, D, and you've got 90 minutes to answer them. So the skills they're looking at is your problem solving skills, so numerical and spatial reasoning, so basically understanding what the numbers are telling you, critical thinking skills, including ability to understand an argument, so what is the writer actually saying, and they want you to use everyday language as well, and understanding that. And then there's the second part of it, which is 30 minutes long, which is a writing task. So it's an essay. You have to be able to write clearly and concisely. And it's about effective communication. They're not subject specific. So, I mean, PPE, you most probably haven't studied any sort of element of that. So anyone who has, that just means you've got a bit more knowledge, but you don't have to, of course, have done that. They're not required. So you just choose one of the 4 questions and you just kind of present an argument about it. History and economics students only do section 1, but they have to sit something else as well. So this applies for both this thinking skills assessment and for the HAT, which is the history one, which is that it's run by Cambridge Assessment. So you must register by 6 p.m. on the 15th of October. Notice it's the same as the UCAS deadline, so make sure that you do register for that. So you need to talk to the exams office at your school about signing up for this. And if you don't sit the assessment, then it can have serious impacts on basically your application. And if you've got access arrangements, make sure you declare them. The test date is currently always on a Wednesday, so it's the 4th of November for this year. And then this only applies for PPE students. You get your results in early January by the assessment board, and you can download a statement of results. With the HAT, you don't get your score initially. The only way you can do that is if you request by email, usually I think it is, or there may be a form you have to fill out to your college, and they can give you a score. But you don't usually find that out, and they only usually allow you to do that in about March time, so it's actually a bit after, so you'll know by then if it's Oxford, if you've actually got in or not. So in terms of preparation for what things you can do, the first thing is section 1 is really, to me, when I had a look at it, the simplest thing that I kind of took from it is you need to be understand what things are saying. And when I say things, it could be graphs or it could be a written passage, and kind of close reading that so you understand what they're actually saying. So for that, there's kind of 2 strands to that. So there's understanding the graphical side of things. So, being able to look at the graph and understand what it tells you. So that's kind of the mathematics, economics side of things. And then as well, the reading comprehension side, which I think is quite important as well. So if there's anything, any challenging text, that's always a good place to start, really. The section 2, it's an essay writing exercise. So of course your writing's got to be legible unless you've got access arrangements that mean you're not writing. You've got to be clear in terms of what you're saying as well. You must fully focus on the question. Make sure it's balanced in terms of you're acknowledging both sides of an argument, but it's very clear why you disagree with that other side. And that's the same for any essay, to be honest. That's what you should be doing. This is why I think this. Well, you don't actually use I, that's one of the other things, but it's about putting forward a point of view and making sure you acknowledge the other side. Make sure you know the format. So first of all, first of all, I just say, look at the papers, familiarize yourself with it. Then I'd start doing practice papers, seeing how you're doing, marking them, then trying other papers and learning from them. Know what you're expecting. So, for example, section 2, it very clearly says you can only write on 2 sides of A4 paper. Okay, so that is the set limit. You cannot go over it. So you've got to, therefore, as I say, concise is really, really important. You've got to get used to writing in that way. So speak to anyone at your school who be able to give you some more information about signing up, and they'll be able to help you as well and support you with that. So as I was saying, practice papers. I always say with these admissions assessments, do not see them as just an admissions assessment. Oh, it's just another thing to learn, because a lot of the skills you learn in an admissions assessment are so applicable to actually your A levels. If you can understand, and also what, society, if you can understand what a graph means, even if it's on the news, that's a great place to start. And actually it will mean you're a lot more well informed. So yeah, make sure as well, doing it with the times towards the end, and read all the information available. For the TSA, there's actually some books that they've said you possibly may want to read, which may help you understand it a little bit more. I haven't read them because I didn't actually do PPE, but that might be quite useful. So that's all the PPE side of things. And then in terms of the history aptitude test, which is only for Oxford, it's required for a number of subjects, including history, ancient and modern history, history and economics, history and English, history and modern languages, and history and politics. Same deadline. It's the same sort of drill. 1 question, 40-mark exam paper. You have 1 hour to do it. If you're looking at past papers, they changed the format last year, so they removed all the other questions, and it's now what used to be the old question 3. That is all there is. And the reason they did that is they said that this question was the most fair question in terms of anyone who's kind of done history can easily approach it. I mean, to be honest, the advice they say is, oh, make sure you understand the format. I mean, they don't actually say, oh, yeah, you have to do these practice papers, but I think they are quite helpful, though some people choose not to use them. Wouldn't recommend that, but that's what people do. And the other questions, those kind of having issues where people were learning how to answer them, whereas this is just about how, you choose to approach it, what skills you have. And they say that people who do well on these assessments are usually the people who do well as well at university. So it's about interpreting a source. It's a source question. So it's the same skills as currently in history, but do not, and this is really, really, really crucial, do not use context. And this is usually the case in every history paper that I've seen, because I've seen some other history assessments when Cambridge used to run them, for example. Context is an absolute do not use. And the reason they say this is because it can actually be quite unfair in terms that, well, if they've studied that period, they'll have more information on that than you will have done. So kind of to level the playing field is about skills, not your context. And if you do use context, you will be marked down for it, okay? So as I say, steer clear of it. If you know who the person is or whatever, you can't do that. The only thing you can do is if it's very clear from the text that it suggests that, then you can mention it. So here are some of the skills that are really important. It's about reading carefully and critically. So, understanding what it's saying, an analytical approach. So once again, it's not a description of what it's saying. You're actually trying to see what you learn from it. Answering them relevantly. So basically stick to your question focus. Handling concepts. So when I say concepts, it usually means things like race, sexuality, gender, those sort of kind of big, wide topics is usually what the questions are aimed at, or class, for example, as well. They're the sort of things that they quite like to look at. And selecting evidence to support points as you would in a normal essay. So, you may have, usually the extracts are like 2 to 4 pages long or so. So it's not about, using every single quote. It's about using the best quotes. So 1 or 2 pieces of evidence to kind of make a point, then making some other points and layering your points together. And it is about originality and independence. So how do you interpret it? That's the important thing. And precision and clarity of writing. So can we understand what you're saying? Are you very clearly staying focused on what you're meant to be doing? So in terms of preparation for that, as always, practice. When I prepared for the hat, I did every single practice paper. I didn't worry about timings initially, but then towards the end, I did try and do it with timings. I actually contacted an admissions tutor at Oxford from the history department to talk to them about this. And some of the advice that they gave was it is very clear about quality, not quantity. So it's usually 1,000 words maximum, which is what you'd usually write, if not shorter, in a usual history A-level paper. But don't count your words. Don't worry about that. Just write what you have time to write in the hour. You shouldn't have an introduction or conclusion. You may have an introductory sentence, which maybe outlines your key argument, but it's not about having a rigid structure. It's more about actually just responding to the question directly. You don't need to recap anything in a conclusion. As it says there, ideas and organizing your ideas into writing. So structure is quite important. So a minimum of 15 minutes planning. That's a minimum, okay? Usually when teachers or whatever were talking about an exam paper, they'd say, oh, you've got a maximum of 5 minutes planning or whatever. No, with this one, I'd say it's a minimum. Because actually, once again, in this email communication I had with an admissions tutor, they made it quite clear that they want you to use a lot of your time actually to think about your ideas, to make sure they're as clear as possible. So that's actually the key point. They're not after, as I say, quantity. It's about the quality. Organize it, stop, reflect, read what you've already written, make sure it makes sense. Is there another point that possibly you could link to that? Then move on, okay? So I asked about, because they said about responding with ideas, so I said, could you use this idea of an argument? So when we say an argument, it's kind of, this is what I think the main message of the text is saying. And they said, yeah, you can do it if you want to. It's about organizing your idea by themes. So, for example, what can we tell about gender relationships? What can we tell about relationships between, different races? Was there a hierarchy in their society? So societal structures, another thing they're quite interested in. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? They're the sort of things that they're looking at, okay? And they won't all be in every single text that they choose to use. So just, of course, be sensible, look for the ones that are there. You don't have to say there is no mention of gender in this text. That's not really, that's kind of, you're trying to say that the text hasn't answered every single question you could have about a period. That's just unrealistic. And it is about examples backing up what you're saying. If you think a passage is unclear, because I did a particular practice paper and I was like, I, to be honest, think that this could be this or it could be this. They said, say so. If you think there could be two interpretations, actually make sure you say that. But give your different interpretations and possibly say, I think this one's a bit more convincing because of this evidence in the text. But as I say, just kind of be honest as such. This is what you genuinely think about the text. Every answer is accepted, so they have a mark scheme of these are the sort of things you could hit, but if you don't hit all of them, it's not a problem. And they'll accept anything else that is clearly supported by the text. Know your mark scheme, so I'll go through it in a second, but do have a look at that. And when you're marking your answer, because sometimes it's advisable to mark your own answer, sometimes it's good to get other people to mark your answer. So have a look at that. Basically, you want to be hitting the high level indicators because basically it's out of 40 marks and 24 is the boundary, okay, between it being classed as a high level answer or a low level answer, okay? If it is a high level answer, then that means that you've passed the assessment, which can help you to get an interview. And if it's below 24, then that means you haven't passed the assessment, and most people who do that do not get on to the next stage. So there is a very clear sort of boundary. I know, just to drop in from my experience, because I've very seriously considered Cambridge, and I'll go through why I did in this other video that I'm talking about that will be coming up soon. But when I was applying to Cambridge, they kind of work a bit differently. They don't really have a pass mark so much. It's more, do they see potential? And they use a lot of other evidence as well, whereas I'd say with this sort of assessment with Oxford, it's a case of, have you passed? That kind of improves your chances of getting an interview. And I'm not saying that people don't get an interview who don't pass the assessment, particularly if it's near the boundary, but that is a major factor that they use in assessing that, particularly as they do think, if you do well, you're showing good potential and you'll succeed. The sources can be niche. So I remember my actual one was a letter written to some ancient kings, I think. There have been literally lists, like inventories of houses. Now, there's actually quite a lot you can tell from them, but they are kind of quite surprising. So you've just got to be used to approaching a lot of different extracts, okay? Because I know from my experience of history, You know, they use tons of diaries or newspaper extracts. And don't get me wrong, they come up, but at the same time, there's a much wider range of sources they can use. They're always written sources, but as I say, could be a whole range of things. So just, if you can, if you've run out of practice papers or just kind of want to start a bit simpler before you kind of challenge yourself by doing a practice paper, then literally it could be any, I don't know. I mean, for example, Equiano, he's an ex-slave who's quite famous. Just read an extract of his book, see what you could learn from that if you've never really studied slavery before. Or, you know, I mean, I think Mary Seacole, she wrote an autobiography. So if you've got that, literally just read a section of that, see what you can get from it, 1 or 2 pages possibly, then work your way up. That's the sort of, that is an example of a source they could use, but it's actually a really accessible one, because I don't think many of you are going to have like 9th century inventories lying around. But, you know, they're the sort of things that you can do for practice. And I'm sure teachers as well, they can give you ones that you can use. I think it's particularly helpful, though, if they're on things you haven't studied, because then it's a lot more realistic in terms of you can't use context. So when you're actually in the exam, you should be looking at the status of the author, because status is one of their kind of key concepts, what you can learn from the source, what it doesn't tell you, if there's questions raised. But as I say, be sensible of what it doesn't tell you. So don't, you know, you can possibly mention that there's no suggestion so much about gender and stuff, but don't just list every single thing that isn't mentioned, because it just kind of comes across as not very kind of perceptive. And do be aware of different kind of, they use a lot of the questions are about social factors or political factors or cultural factors. So it is maybe a good idea, it might save yourself some time when you're actually in the room. Try and just get yourself a definition of what you think social is, what you think cultural is, what you think political is. And also go through the past papers and see if there's any other words I haven't mentioned that actually maybe don't have quite as clear meaning as you think, because you think social and cultural is easy. Well, actually, they aren't. There are kind of, it's quite unclear kind of what is which. So it's really good idea actually, before you get in there, think about that, possibly look online, see what the Google definitions are or what the Oxford English Dictionary definitions are, and just try and get sort of a definition that possibly you could use to say, I'm going to explore the social factors are, I'm going to look at the cultural factors are. I think the paper I'm referring to currently is the 2018 one. Just for kind of reference. So just think about those things. And it's kind of my approach when I looked at that question was to look at, okay, I'm going to look at the social factors, I'm going to look at the cultural factors, and I'm going to look at where I think the line is blurred and how I think they interact. Because that's perceptive again, because you're saying, yes, it fits in this box, so I'm responding to the first strand of the question. It fits in this box, so I'm responding to the second strand of the question. But actually, I'm now going to respond to both of them at the same time and show you how it's a bit more complex than what I've just said. So they're usually, the questions are, I'd call them 2-pronged. They ask 2 things. Sometimes they link, sometimes they're political and social, that sort of thing. So have a look and kind of get that clear to yourself. Okay, so this is just the mark scheme here. So the 33 to 40 marks and the 23 to 32 marks is where you're aiming for. These are some of the things they want you to have a look at. Okay, so it's historical insight and perception. So it's contemporary social and cultural values. So what can you tell about these from the text? Here are your concepts: gender, class, power, and race. They come up quite a lot in their questions. They're the sort of big picture things they want you to look at. So if you're choosing text, they're particular good things to look at, which is why when I suggested about Equiano or Mary Seacole, actually maybe they could be good starting texts if you wanted to have a look at them. So genre and associated problems. So, you know, what are the problems with it being a list? What are the problems with it being a letter? Once again, don't go with the stock answer of everything is wrong with it or whatever, because you've got to acknowledge the merits of a source, but what you possibly want to hear more about. Nuance, okay, so that is about showing these different perceptions, how they link together, and cautious conclusions, okay, so don't be like 100% it definitely says this. You can say things like the source suggests this, or I can infer from the source, and those sort of key phrases. And I'm sure if you looked online, you'll find these sort of cautious conclusion phrases, but don't be kind of like bang, you know, smashing in there saying that it 100% it definitely says this and no other interpretation is possible, because you don't know the historical context. So And cautious conclusions is an important thing in academia as well. And I think it's important to raise that, actually, that when you are going to university or whatever, your essays, when you're writing them, they have to be cautious. Academics can't overstate the amount of evidence there is. So coverage and use of evidence, so it's efficient coverage of a range of material. So what I mean by that is, do not choose all of your quotes from the first paragraph. It's fine if you want to start at the start, because it's a nice place to start, strangely enough. But actually just pick quotes from throughout the text that support your point. And I think it makes your point a lot stronger if you use some quotes from the start, middle, and end. So you don't have to follow that structure. If the one at the end actually was the thing that initially suggested this idea, start at the quote at the end. And then say, actually, well, then when I look further into the text, I found these other quotes, and this is how they link to it. But make sure that you're showing that you have read the whole text and you're linking it together, and you're kind of choosing bits from throughout it. Don't make it sound like you only read the last paragraph or the first paragraph. Carefully selecting your evidence, so make sure it's you can back it up to say you think it says what you're suggesting it does. So consider the context is written around. So it may seem a great quote if you only take these words out of it, but does it actually mean that in the wider context of the sentence? And choosing the best quotes. See it as you're giving them the cream of your knowledge, the cream of your argument, and kind of the rest of it, 95% of it, you're not even going to tell them because it's not as strong. Avoid moral judgment, so don't be like, all these views are outdated or whatever. We're not there for your opinion in terms of if you think is right or wrong. We're there to hear what you're actually arguing. Avoid external knowledge, so this is your context, and selectively use quotations. I've spoken about that quite extensively. So shape, structure, and style of your answer, direct answer. So as I say, I think a really good way to show this is a nice, strong introductory sentence. Don't spend ages writing it, but maybe in that one sentence, and I think this is a good thing for anything you write, in that first sentence, I should be able to kind of tell what possibly you suggested. And you're kind of getting right to the point of what you're arguing straight away. Thematically arrange your paragraphs. So if it's about money, let's say, then do everything about money in your first paragraph. There's nothing wrong later on if this point later on links to money, but I would cover money quite well in your first paragraph if that's what it's talking about. Material from different passages, that's what I was saying, using all of the evidence available to you clearly and with clarity, so that's in terms of meaning. You don't need big fancy words. Don't literally throw an Oxford thesaurus at them. Use the words that come to you. If they happen to be high-level words, great, but don't feel like you have to spend 10 minutes making yourself sound great. Just go with what you're confident in saying. And we're right at the end of kind of the section of this in terms of the content. So where to look for preparing for the assessments. So the TSA, there's the link there, and the hat is the same. Alternatively, all I did was literally went on Google, typed in Oxford admissions assessments. It comes up with a page, and it just says, what subject do you want to study? Click it, literally click the subject you want to study, and it will pop up all this information. Everything I've just told you about, apart from some of the verbal stuff from my experience of the hat, is all on there. So if you forget anything or want to check anything, it's all on there. Have a search online if you need any other advice. Zero gravity, if you're from a state school and you're eligible, you fulfill the criteria. Source analysis, so use what skills you already have. Practice using unseen sources. And also another thing to really important to say about the hat is, I think actually on the hat page on the Oxford thing, they actually share to a YouTube video, and what it is it's a tutor at an Oxford college with 3 of their first year students who sat a hat paper, and they're going to talk through the hat paper that they actually sat, and they talk through their ideas, I think it is. Off the top of my head, I may not be correct, but I know there's this video around that actually they talk through a paper and what ideas they have, and they discuss, and the admissions tutor says what they're looking for. So that is a really good thing to watch. If you know your college has got an assessment, I don't think it can be massively different from the hat. I can't see it being like a whole world away because source analysis is so important. One thing I would say is I nearly sat the last, as it turns out, year of the official Cambridge University history assessment. Now, unfortunately, all the materials for that I never downloaded because I didn't quite get that far. And you can't really find much about it online. But the format they followed was slightly different, where instead of it being 2 parts to the question, what they did was it was 2 sources, and you had to compare them as to what they were saying. So that's possibly something to have a look at as well, because from what I can tell, it's either going to be a format like what I've just gone through, which is the Oxford Hat similar format, or it will be comparing two sources. I can't think it will be much different to that, to be honest.